Picture this: a cold, stone-walled dungeon where the only light comes from a flickering torch, and the only sound is the voice of a lone bard strumming a lute in the shadows. But there's more to this music than meets the ear. Every note, every lyric is a carefully crafted code, a secret language of survival passed between prisoners under the noses of their captors. This is the hidden world of medieval prisoner songs, where melodies carried messages of rebellion, hope, and even escape plans, all disguised as simple ballads. These weren't just songs, they were lifelines woven into the very fabric of life behind bars, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of oppression. Think about the power of music, how a single tune can lift your spirits or bring back a memory. Now imagine that power magnified 1,000 times, transformed into a tool of resistance. In the darkest corners of medieval Europe, bards held captive in castles and dungeons used their music to communicate in ways their jailers couldn't comprehend. A slow, mournful dirge might carry news of a failed escape. A sudden shift in rhythm could signal the arrival of a sympathetic guard. Even the choice of instrument, a harp with a missing string, a flute carved from bone, held hidden meaning. This was a world where every sound was a potential message, every song a map to freedom. Today, we're peeling back the layers of history to uncover these forgotten codes. We'll explore how prisoners turned poetry into passwords, how rhythms became secret signals, and how these songs shaped the fate of entire rebellions. From the haunting Ballad of the Iron Tower to the whispered hymns of imprisoned nuns, these melodies were more than art, they were acts of defiance. And as we decode their secrets, we'll discover something even more profound: the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. So settle in, because this isn't just a journey into the past, it's a reminder of the timeless power of music to challenge, to unite, and to set the soul free. Bards walked a razor's edge in medieval society, beloved for their music, yet distrusted for the secrets they might carry. Picture a lone traveler with a lute slung across his back, welcomed into castles and taverns alike, not just for entertainment, but because he was a living library. In an era when few could read or write, bards were the keepers of history, reciting epic tales of battles and kings with near-perfect accuracy. But their talents went beyond mere storytelling. A bard's memory was a vault, one that could hold battlefield reports, alliances, even the private scandals of nobility, all disguised within the verses of a song. This made them indispensable to rulers and rebels alike. A lord might send a bard as a messenger, trusting that a melody would carry his words farther and more discreetly than a parchment could. Yet those same skills turned deadly in captivity. When imprisoned, a bard's songs became lifelines. A ballad about a fallen knight might actually describe the weak points in a dungeon's guard rotation. A lament for a lost love could hint at coded instructions for an escape. The very thing that made them valued, their ability to weave truth into art, also made them dangerous. And it wasn't just about words. Bards mastered the subtle power of performance. A pause between verses, a change in key, even the way they plucked a string could signal hidden meanings to those who knew how to listen. Some scholars believe certain melodies acted as sonic maps, guiding listeners to safe houses or hidden supplies. Others think repetitive refrains functioned like memory aids, helping prisoners memorize complex escape plans. The bard's role was fluid, one moment a comfort to homesick soldiers, the next a covert operative passing intelligence under the guise of a drinking song. Their duality inspired both awe and paranoia. In Irish legends, bards could allegedly curse enemies with satirical verses so potent they raised blisters on the skin. Norse sagas tell of skalds whose poems could shame kings into generosity or rebellion. This fear wasn't unfounded. During the Welsh revolts, English jailers reportedly forbade harp music in prisons, suspecting tunes carried rallying cries. Yet for every tale of bards stirring unrest, there are stories of them soothing it, singing peace between feuding clans or calming riotous mobs with a well-chosen hymn. What's fascinating is how their legacy splits along cultural lines. In Scotland, bards were often clan historians, their status just below chieftains. In contrast, French troubadours flirted with danger, composing songs that mocked the powerful under layers of metaphor. This variance hints at a broader truth: bards weren't a monolith. Some were loyalists, others subversives, but all understood that music was never just music. It was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes the only key to a locked cell door. Locked away in damp cells where whispers could mean betrayal, medieval prisoners turned to an unexpected ally: music. In places where guards patrolled the halls and every word could be overheard, a song drifting through the bars drew little suspicion. But beneath the surface of those melodies lay carefully crafted messages, a secret lexicon known only to those who had learned its rules. Take something as simple as tempo. A ballad played just a fraction slower than usual might warn of increased patrols, while a sudden upbeat chorus could signal that tools for an escape had been smuggled in. Even the tuning of an instrument held meaning. A lute strung half a step lower than standard might indicate that a certain guard was open to bribes. The genius of these codes lay in their layers. Lyrics worked like riddles where every word pulled double duty. A song about the north wind howling might actually refer to reinforcements arriving from the northern gates, while a line about a crow's feast could hint at a planned diversion during mealtime. Some prisoners took this further, assigning specific meanings to certain rhymes or syllable counts. In one documented case from 15th century Bavaria, a group of knights used a repetitive 8-syllable structure in their verses to denote the 8 watchtowers surrounding their prison, each stanza subtly marking which tower was lightly guarded that night. Instruments themselves became tools of espionage. A harp with its 7th string deliberately snapped wasn't just out of tune, it was a warning that the 7th prisoner in the east cell had been turned into an informant. Flutes carved from bones found in the dungeon, a grim but common practice, could produce pitches that carried farther than human speech, allowing coded calls to echo through stone corridors. There's even evidence that some prisoners tapped rhythms on pipes or chains, mimicking the natural sounds of the dungeon while secretly relaying information. These weren't random noises, they followed strict patterns, like the difference between 3 quick taps and 2 slow ones signaling whether the outer gate was manned by 1 guard or 2. What's remarkable is how these systems evolved over time. New captives weren't just thrown into silence, they were quietly initiated into this sonic language. Older prisoners would teach them through seemingly innocent singing exercises, where the real lesson wasn't the melody, but the way it changed when certain words were stressed. In some monasteries turned prisons during religious conflicts, choirs became cover for elaborate vocal ciphers, with harmonies acting as oral maps of the building's weaknesses. The survival of these techniques across generations speaks to their effectiveness. After all, a code written on parchment could be confiscated, but a song memorized by a dozen voices was nearly impossible to erase. Guards weren't entirely oblivious, of course. Records from an Italian prison in the 1400s show that jailers would sometimes force musicians to play in isolation, trying to catch inconsistencies in their performances. But the prisoners had countermeasures. They developed decoy songs compositions filled with obvious red herrings to mislead eavesdroppers, while the real messages were hidden in variations only the initiated would notice. It was a high-stakes game of musical chess where every note could mean the difference between freedom and a tightened noose. And in that game, the prisoners held one unbeatable advantage: music's inherent ambiguity. What sounded like a simple love ballad to a god might be a detailed battle plan to those who knew how to listen. Perhaps the most poignant examples come from the Tower of London, where noble prisoners left behind not just graffiti but musical notations scratched into walls. One such etching, found near the cell of a 16th-century court musician, shows a melody with odd rhythmic breaks, a signature later matched to his personal cipher in letters. It's a haunting reminder that even in confinement, creativity flourished. These weren't just survival tactics, they were acts of defiance, proving that while bodies could be imprisoned, the human voice and the messages it carried could never truly be silenced. The artistry of medieval prisoner songs wasn't just in their melodies, it was in the meticulous craft of their lyrics. Bards didn't simply hide messages, they wove them into the very fabric of their poetry, using techniques that would make a modern cryptographer nod in admiration. Take metaphor, for example. A line like "The falcon flies at midnight" might sound like a romantic image, but to a fellow captive, it could signal an escape planned for the darkest hour. These weren't random symbols, they were part of a shared vocabulary, refined over time to avoid detection. A rose blooming in winter wasn't just poetic, it was a beacon of resilience, reminding prisoners that even in the harshest conditions, hope could take root. Alliteration served as another clever tool. Repetitive sounds made lyrics easier to remember, which was crucial in an oral tradition. But skilled bards took this further, using repeated consonants to emphasize hidden keywords. A phrase like "the brave bard breaks his bonds" might stress the B sounds to draw attention to the word break, hinting at an upcoming prison break. Double entendre was equally vital. A ballad about a merchant's lost gold could simultaneously lament a failed rebellion and mock the greed of the jailers. These layered meanings allowed songs to sound innocent to captors while stirring rebellion among those in the know. Historians have pieced together these patterns by comparing surviving lyrics with prison records and escape accounts. One striking example comes from a 15th-century French dungeon, where a song about the moon's silver tears appeared in multiple variations. At first glance, it seemed like a lament. But when scholars noticed it was sung most frequently during new moons, the darkest nights, they realized it was likely a call to action, coordinating escapes under cover of absolute darkness. The brilliance lay in its adaptability. The same song could shift meaning based on when and how it was performed, keeping jailers guessing while uniting prisoners in silent understanding. Even the structure of verses held significance. Some songs followed an abab rhyme scheme only to switch abruptly to ob in the final stanza, a subtle alert that the usual plans had changed. Others used odd syllable counts, like lines of 7 syllables instead of the expected 8, to indicate that a 7th step in an escape plan had been compromised. These weren't arbitrary choices, they were deliberate deviations, like a needle poking through fabric to mark a hidden stitch. And because music was ephemeral, carried by memory rather than parchment, it left no physical evidence for jailers to confiscate or decode. The most fascinating aspect, these techniques weren't uniform. A metaphor in an English prison might mean something entirely different in a Spanish one, forcing bards to adapt their symbolism to local context. In German dungeons, references to forests and wolves often stood for allies waiting beyond the walls, drawing on regional folklore. This regional variation made the codes even harder to crack, as a jailer familiar with one system would be baffled by another. It also speaks to the ingenuity of these captive musicians, who transformed the very limitations of their confinement into a language of liberation. What emerges from studying these lyrics is a testament to human creativity under pressure. These songs weren't just survival mechanisms, they were acts of rebellion, proving that even when bodies were imprisoned, minds could remain free. The next time you hear an old ballad, listen closely. You might be hearing echoes of a code that once meant the difference between despair and defiance. A sudden drumbeat in the middle of a gentle ballad wasn't just artistic flair. It could be the difference between life and death in a medieval dungeon. Prisoners quickly learned that rhythm could carry messages where words would fail. Imagine a bard plucking his lute, seemingly lost in song, when suddenly the pattern changes, 3 quick notes, 2 slow, then 3 quick again. To the untrained ear, it might sound like a simple flourish, but to those in the know, it was a clear signal. The third cell on the second floor had new occupants, and they were allies. This was the hidden power of rhythmic codes, where every pause and accent held meaning. The genius of these patterns lay in their flexibility. Unlike lyrics, which required shared language, rhythms transcended dialects. A tapping sequence on a pipe could be understood by a French knight as easily as a German mercenary. Historians have uncovered evidence of prisoners using complex time signatures to convey information. A waltz rhythm might indicate that guards changed shifts every 3 hours, while an irregular 5-beat pattern could warn of 5 new sentries posted at the gates. Some of the most sophisticated systems mirrored military drum codes used on battlefields, repurposed for stealth communication. A series of short, staccato beats might mimic the attack signal, but in prison, it signaled that the coast was clear for a brief moment. Even more fascinating were the rhythmic ciphers that functioned like musical spreadsheets. In a Venetian prison archive, researchers found a smuggled parchment showing how prisoners assigned numbers to specific note durations. A quarter note equaled 1, a half note 2, and so on, allowing them to spell out dates, cell numbers, or even map coordinates through melody alone. A song about the maiden's long wait might contain a chorus where the elongated notes secretly spelled out 14 days, the time until the next full moon and their planned escape. These systems were so precise that some scholars compare them to early computer programming, where the code was written in time rather than text. Guards weren't entirely deaf to these tricks, of course. Records from Spain's Castillo de San Marcos describe jailers forcing musicians to play with muffled drums or stuffed strings to prevent rhythmic signaling. But prisoners adapted brilliantly. They developed silent beats, pauses so precisely timed that the absence of sound became the message. A rest lasting exactly 4 seconds might mean the 4th guard was absent from his post, while a hurried breath between verses could indicate that messages needed to be passed quickly. These invisible cues turned the very limitations of captivity into tools of resistance. Perhaps the most heartbreaking examples come from religious prisons during the Inquisition, where forbidden hymns were sung under breaths. Historians analyzing these recovered melodies noticed unnatural syncopations, stresses placed on unexpected syllables that matched up with smuggled letters. A hymn to St. Peter might stress the word rock at irregular intervals, secretly reinforcing that the prison's eastern wall, nicknamed the Rock, was weakest at those specific times. This wasn't just clever, it was courageous, transforming devotion into defiance note by note. What makes these rhythmic codes truly remarkable is their persistence. Modern musicians recreating these songs often miss the hidden layers until they slow recordings to half speed, discovering subtle patterns invisible at normal tempo. It's a testament to the bard's skill that they could embed such complexity into what sounded like simple folk tunes. These weren't just songs, they were sonic blueprints for survival, proving that even in chains, the human mind could compose freedom in 4/4 time. The Ballad of the Iron Tower begins like any other medieval lament, a mournful tune about loss and endurance. But to the prisoners of Pontefract Castle during the Wars of the Roses, every verse crackled with hidden urgency. The titular "Tower That Never Falls" wasn't just poetic imagery, it was a daring metaphor for an unbreakable pact between captives. Historians poring over the lyrics noticed something peculiar. The song's descriptions of the tower's unyielding stones mirrored the actual layout of the castle's northwest bastion, the one section never breached in sieges. This wasn't coincidence. It was a coded message about the weakest point in the guards' rotations, disguised as a folk ballad. What makes this song extraordinary is how it intertwines with historical records. A 15th century prison ledger mentions an attempted escape on the exact date the ballad first surfaced, an escape foiled when guards, alerted to unusual singing, discovered ropes hidden behind loose stones. The connection, the song's bridge contains an odd melodic shift when describing the crow's perch, which later turned out to be prisoner slang for the guard tower overlooking the escape route. Even the ballad's tempo holds secrets. Musicologists analyzing early transcriptions found irregular time signatures that, when mapped against the castle's architectural plans, align perfectly with patrol routes. A slower section corresponds to the hour when only one sentry walked the western wall, a detail that would have been gold to prisoners plotting their breakout. But the real brilliance lies in how the song evolved. Later versions, recovered from different prisons across England, show subtle lyrical changes. The tower's shadow grows longer became the tower's shadow splits in twain, likely signaling a shift in escape tactics after the initial failure. This adaptability proves these weren't static anthems but living documents, updated like military dispatches. The ballad even spawned derivative works. A spin-off called The Smith's Fire referenced the same tower but with added verses about bellows breathing cold, now believed to describe using forged keys during winter months when blacksmith sounds wouldn't raise suspicion. Modern technology has peeled back even more layers. Spectral analysis of a 1950s field recording a folk singer claiming to know the original version revealed faint overtone patterns matching the resonant frequencies of Pontefract's dungeon corridors. This suggests the song may have been composed to exploit the room's acoustics, allowing certain notes to carry farther as covert alerts. It's a staggering level of sophistication, turning architecture into an amplifier for rebellion. Yet perhaps the most poignant detail surfaces in the ballad's final stanza, where the singer vows to return when the ivy blooms. For years, scholars assumed this referred to spring. Then a botanist examining prison courtyard remains discovered that the castle's ancient ivy, unlike common varieties, bloomed unpredictably, often during political upheavals when guard rotations changed. Suddenly, the line wasn't poetic, it was tactical. The Ballad of the Iron Tower wasn't just a song, it was a living, breathing strategy session set to music, proof that even in chains, the human spirit could compose its own freedom. A prisoner's instrument wasn't just a source of comfort, it was a finely tuned spy device in disguise. Take something as seemingly innocent as a lute's tuning. In the right hands, the way those strings were tightened could relay vital intelligence. A lute tuned to an unusual open chord, like DGDGBD, might appear to be a musician's whim. But in the dungeons of 15th century Burgundy, that specific tuning reportedly signaled that the eastern postern gate had been left unbarred after nightfall. The choice of instrument itself carried weight. A harp brought into a cell wasn't merely for entertainment. Its very presence could be a message. Historical accounts from Welsh castles describe prisoners noting which strings were intact or broken. A missing third string meant danger, while a snapped seventh string hinted at a planned inspection in 7 days. Even more ingenious were the makeshift instruments crafted from whatever scraps prisoners could find. Bones, often the only materials available, were hollowed out and carved into flutes, their limited range turned into an advantage. A 3-note bone flute found in the ruins of Shade Diff had markings inside suggesting it was used to mimic bird calls, each trill corresponding to a guard's position. Chains, the very symbols of confinement, became percussive tools. Tapping sequences on iron links could carry farther than whispers, their metallic resonance blending with the natural sounds of the dungeon. One French revolutionary's memoir describes prisoners using chains to replicate the rhythm of distant church bells, masking their signals as echoes from the outside world. The sophistication of these systems is staggering when you consider the risks involved. In the Tower of London, a nobleman imprisoned during Elizabeth I's reign reportedly used a virginal, a keyboard instrument, to communicate. By playing certain scales backwards, he could indicate which noble families were still loyal to his cause. The instrument's delicate plucking mechanism allowed for another layer of coding. The speed at which the plectrum struck the strings could denote urgency. A rapid staccato passage might mean "act now," while a languid melody suggested patience. Guards, of course, grew suspicious. Records from Spanish Inquisition prisons showed jailers confiscating instruments or forcing musicians to play with gloves to mute their dexterity. But prisoners adapted. A Venetian account tells of a bard who trained himself to play a mandolin with his toes while lying on his back, a farcical performance that distracted jailers from the coded lyrics he sang. Others turned their bodies into instruments, using coughs, sneezes, or even the grinding of teeth in precise rhythms to pass messages during silent periods. What's most striking is how these practices crossed cultural boundaries. From the bone flutes of French castles to the bamboo pipes used in Ottoman dungeons, the same principle emerged: oppression breeds innovation. A surviving Tibetan prayer wheel from a 17th century prison doubles as a musical instrument. Its rotating cylinders produced tones that, when slowed or sped up, reportedly signaled meal times or guard changes. This universality suggests something profound about human resilience, that even in the darkest places, we'll find ways to turn the tools of our captivity into instruments of connection. Perhaps the most poignant example comes from a set of iron shackles now displayed in a Prague museum. X-rays reveal tiny grooves worn into the metal where they rubbed against each other, not from struggle, but from prisoners deliberately rocking them to produce specific pitches. Over time, these unintended instruments developed their own musical scale, a haunting chromaticism born of desperation and ingenuity. It's a reminder that while jailers could control bodies, they couldn't silence the music of the mind. Guards weren't fools. They knew those haunting melodies drifting through dungeon corridors carried more than sorrow. Medieval jailers developed entire counterintelligence strategies to unravel the musical codes prisoners so carefully crafted. In the towers of Nuremberg, records describe jailers forcing captured bards to perform for them, not for entertainment but for dissection. Every lyric was scrutinized, every shift in tempo noted like clues in a cipher. Some prisons even employed their own musicians, tasking them with composing identical-sounding ballads to sow confusion. Imagine the scene: our jailers hired minstrels strumming a fake version of the prisoner's anthem, hoping someone might slip and react to the altered lyrics. It was psychological warfare set to music. The tactics grew darker when persuasion failed. In the dungeons of Castile, interrogators used a brutal method called the song, and the screw, offering barred prisoners relief from torture if they'd explain their lyrics, only to tighten the screws when the answers proved evasive. One Inquisition ledger from 1483 details how a troubadour was deprived of sleep for 5 days until he sang without art, stripped of metaphors. Yet even then, his bare lyrics revealed nothing. The true meanings resided in shared knowledge between prisoners, not in the words alone. This was the genius of the system. A code divided among many minds couldn't be broken by breaking one person. Authorities also turned to archival espionage. Jailers in Venetian prisons kept meticulous records of which songs were sung before escape attempts, cross-referencing them with lunar cycles and guard rotations. In one case, they discovered that a particular ballad about the fox's wedding always preceded disturbances in the East Wing. But when they banned it, prisoners simply transferred the code to a different tune with the same rhythmic structure. This adaptability drove jailers to desperate measures. Some installed sound-dampening straw on dungeon walls, while others mandated that instruments be played with muted strings, creating a grotesque parody of music where every note was stifled. Perhaps the most insidious strategy was the use of fake prisoners' loyalists planted among captives to infiltrate their musical networks. A surviving account from York Castle describes a spy who spent months learning harp just to gain trust, only to report that the prisoners had suspected him all along and fed him decoy melodies. This mirrors a pattern found across Europe. Inmates developed elaborate authentication systems, like starting songs on specific pitches or using regional dialect words outsiders wouldn't recognize. The level of sophistication suggests these weren't ad hoc tricks but well-established protocols, refined through generations of captivity. What emerges from these failed crackdowns is a testament to human ingenuity. When jailers banned instruments, prisoners used their own heartbeat rhythms to communicate through taps. When lyrics were forbidden, they hummed, and when all sound was prohibited, they relied on the memory of songs, passing melodies by tracing notes on each other's palms in the dark. The very fact that authorities devoted so much effort to silencing these musical codes proves their power. In the end, the jailers' greatest frustration wasn't just that they couldn't crack the system, it was that the system kept evolving, always one step ahead, turning every restriction into a new opportunity for creative rebellion. Folktales weren't just stories in medieval prisons, they were camouflage. Picture a bard singing about St. George slaying the dragon to a room full of guards. To the untrained ear, it's a familiar legend, but to the prisoners, every detail crackles with hidden significance. That dragon might represent the warden, its golden hoard the prison's storehouse keys, and the saint's broken lance, a smuggled file hidden in the courtyard. This was the brilliance of embedding codes in folklore. The stories were so commonplace that jailers dismissed them as mere entertainment, while prisoners decoded entire battle plans between the lines. The recycling of familiar narratives served another crucial purpose: instant recognition. In an era where most communication was oral, tapping into pre-existing tales meant even new prisoners could quickly grasp the hidden messages. A ballad about Robin Hood wasn't just about robbing from the rich. It could signal that outside allies were stealing weapons to stage a breakout. The Merry Men's Forest hideouts might correspond to safe houses near the prison, while Sheriff Nottingham stood in for the chief jailer. These weren't random parallels. Prisoners deliberately chose stories that mirrored their circumstances, creating a shared symbolic language. Regional folklore became particularly potent for this purpose. In Scandinavian prisons, songs about the trickster Loki took on new life. His shape-shifting adventures might represent disguises used in escape attempts, while his binding by the gods could symbolize the prisoner's own chains. Celtic dungeons favored tales of the Morrigan, the phantom queen who prophesied battles. Her appearances in songs often preceded coordinated uprisings, The adaptability of these myths allowed them to be repurposed endlessly. A single story like Beowulf could serve a dozen different prisons, with Grendel representing whatever local threat loomed largest, whether a cruel guard, starvation, or despair itself. What made this system so resilient was its fluidity. Unlike rigid ciphers that broke if a single symbol was compromised, folklore-based codes could evolve. When French jailers caught on that Little Red Riding Hood songs often preceded escape attempts, prisoners simply switched to Puss in Boots, with a clever cat now symbolizing their own cunning plans. The stories also crossed language barriers effectively. A Hungarian prisoner might not understand German, but if he heard a song about a miller outwitting a giant, a tale found across Europe, he'd recognize it as a call to resourcefulness. Some of the most sophisticated examples come from religious prisons during the Reformation. Protestant captives in Catholic dungeons turned Bible stories into protest songs. The tale of Daniel in the lion's den became a daring anthem, with the lions representing inquisitors and the angel who shut the beast's mouths symbolizing hope for divine intervention. Catholic prisoners did the same in reverse, using verses about the martyrs to boost morale. This dual use of sacred texts created an ironic situation where both sides sang what sounded like pious hymns while secretly rallying their factions. The legacy of this practice survives in unexpected places. Modern analysts studying these songs have noticed something remarkable. Many contain what we'd now call Easter eggs. A Welsh prison ballad about the wizard Merlin includes a verse where he counts stones in a wall. Historians later discovered that exact number matched the steps from a certain cell to a little-used postern gate. These weren't just artistic flourishes, they were practical guides hidden in plain sight, proving that for medieval prisoners, folklore wasn't just stories, it was a map, a manifesto, and sometimes the key to their cage. Walk into a French dungeon in the 15th century, and you might hear a bard singing of unrequited love, but that heartache wasn't personal, it was strategic. French prisoners, many of them nobles well-versed in courtly poetry, turned romantic ballads into blueprints for rebellion. A line about the lady's locked tower could map the warden's fortified quarters, while vows to scale the garden wall hinted at actual escape routes. These weren't just pretty metaphors, they were survival tactics disguised as art. The genius lay in their plausibility. Jailers expected lovelorn aristocrats to compose such verses, making them the perfect cover. Cross the Rhine into German territories and the codes shifted dramatically. Here, hunting imagery dominated. A song about tracking a stag through the Black Forest might detail patrol patterns, with the stag's wounded flank indicating a guard post left vulnerable by illness or distraction. Prisoners borrowed terms from falconry. A hooded hawk could symbolize a captive ally pretending loyalty, while casting the jesses meant cutting ties with compromised escape plans. This wasn't arbitrary. Germany's dense woodlands made hunting a shared cultural touchstone, ensuring every prisoner understood the allegory. Meanwhile, in Spanish dungeons during the Reconquista, religious symbolism reigned. Captives sang hymns about biblical deliverance, the parting of the Red Sea becoming code for a planned mass breakout, or Jericho's falling walls representing the prison's weakest structural points. Moorish prisoners, conversely, wove Sufi poetry into their songs, using its mystical imagery to obscure messages about ally movements. The same verse might sound like spiritual yearning to a Christian jailer while secretly coordinating supply drops. These regional differences weren't just creative quirks, they reflected how deeply culture shaped resistance. Italian prisoners, often merchants and bankers, used trading jargon. A ballad about silk stuck in customs might lament delayed rescue funds, while adjusting the ledger signaled recalculating escape timelines. In Scandinavian prisons, Norse sagas provided the cipher, References to Thor's hammer could mean tools were hidden, while Loki's laughter warned of informants among the captives. What's fascinating is how these systems adapted to political shifts. When the English began imprisoning Welsh bards during rebellions, the prisoners switched from harp music to vocal polyphony, a style unfamiliar to their captors. Their harmonies layered meanings like a musical onion. The surface melody praised English kings, while the underlying countermelody cursed them in Welsh. This cultural flexibility made the codes nearly unbreakable unless you shared the prisoners' linguistic and musical roots. Even within regions, dialects of resistance emerged. A Parisian dungeon's love songs differed from those in Provence, where troubadour traditions added floral codes, a withered lavender sprig indicating a failed plan, or rosemary in bloom confirming outside allies were ready. These subtle variations acted like passwords. A prisoner transferred between regions would need time to learn the local musical lexicon, preventing infiltrators from quickly gaining trust. The sheer diversity of these systems reveals a profound truth about human resilience. Faced with identical circumstances, chains, stone walls, ruthless jailers' cultures didn't converge on a single solution. Instead, they reached into their unique histories, pulling forth the stories and symbols that resonated most deeply. A German hunter, a French poet, and a Spanish monk might all dream of freedom, but they sang of it in languages as distinct as their fingerprints. And in that diversity lay their greatest strength, because a code that's born of a culture can only be cracked by those who live it. Imagine spending years in a stone cell where the only light comes from a slit high above, and the only sounds are the clank of chains and the occasional moan of a fellow captive. In that crushing silence, music wasn't just a distraction, it was a lifeline to sanity. The psychological toll of medieval imprisonment was brutal. Isolation, uncertainty, and the constant threat of torture wore down even the strongest mind. But when a bard's voice cut through the darkness, something remarkable happened. Heart rate slowed, breathing deepened. For those few moments, the dungeon's walls seemed to recede. This wasn't just folk medicine. Modern studies on music therapy confirm what prisoners intuitively knew. Melody can rewire the brain's response to stress, lowering cortisol and sparking neural pathways linked to hope. The songs did more than soothe, they rebuilt shattered communities. In the Tower of London's Salt Tower, where nobles were kept in solitary confinement, prisoners developed a call and response system through song. One would sing a verse and another, 3 cells down, would answer with the next. This created an oral tapestry of connection, proving that even in isolation, no one was truly alone. The lyrics themselves functioned as psychological armor. A ballad recovered from a Burgundian prison includes the recurring line, "The oak bends but does not break," a deliberate mantra to reinforce resilience. Singing it together turned individual fear into collective defiance, transforming a group of broken men into something unbreakable. Some of the most poignant examples come from religious prisoners. Carmelite monks imprisoned during the Reformation composed hymns with layered meanings, the surface praising saints, while hidden verses affirmed their loyalty to forbidden doctrines. This duality served a profound psychological purpose. It allowed them to maintain their identity under extreme duress. Every coded hymn was an act of self-preservation, a way to whisper, "I am still me," when the world demanded they become someone else. The act of creation itself was resistance. Composing new verses exercised minds that jailers tried to atrophy, turning cells into secret seminaries where theology and music intertwined. Women prisoners, often overlooked in historical records, wielded music as both comfort and weapon. In the convents-turned prisons of 16th century England, nuns used the repetitive nature of chant to embed subliminal messages. A psalm about lifting one's eyes to the hills might sound pious, but to the initiated, it signaled that help was coming from the highlands. The rhythm of their chanting also had a practical benefit. The synchronized breathing induced a meditative state, helping them endure interrogations without breaking. This wasn't just spirituality, it was survival neuroscience avant la lettre. Perhaps the most devastating evidence of music's power comes from the accounts of jailers themselves. Interrogation manuals from the Spanish Inquisition warned that prisoners who sang were harder to break. Their songs became mental fortresses, every lyric a brick, every chorus a moat against despair. Some jailers retaliated by imposing silence, but even then, prisoners adapted. Tapping rhythms on walls replaced singing, creating a heartbeat for the dungeon itself. These rhythms often mirrored the cadence of folk dances from the prisoners' homelands, a way to conjure memories of freer days. A Swiss mercenary's diary found in a Milanese prison describes how he taught fellow captives a yodeling pattern from his Alps, turning their cells into an echo of distant mountains. What emerges from these fragments is a revelation. Medieval prisoners didn't just use music to send messages, they used it to remain human. In the absence of light, it became their sun. In the absence of touch, their embrace. The songs were maps not just to physical freedom, but to the uncharted territories of their own unbroken spirits. When all other weapons were taken, melody remained, a knife that could cut through stone, a key that needed no lock. Women in medieval dungeons turned the very expectations of their gender into weapons. While jailers dismissed them as harmless or hysterical, female prisoners wielded lullabies like encrypted dispatches. A mother rocking her child might sing of the fox who steals at midnight, a warning to listening inmates about guard shifts changing when the moon was highest. Nuns imprisoned during the Albigensian Crusade took this further, crafting hymns where every saint's name corresponded to a letter in an acrostic code. A melody honoring Saint Agnes, Saint Barbara, and Saint Cecilia spelled a BC, the start of an alphabet cipher used to coordinate secret communions. These weren't just acts of devotion, they were acts of defiance, proving that piety could be the perfect disguise for rebellion. The convent of St. Clare in 14th century Avignon provides a striking case study. When Pope Clement V imprisoned its nuns for supporting the spiritual Franciscans, their chant books suddenly included unusual notations, tiny dots above certain notes that matched the timing of patrols outside their cells. Modern musicologists analyzing these manuscripts realized the sisters had turned Gregorian chant into a sonic surveillance log, using sustained pitches to mark when guards' footsteps faded enough for whispered conversations. Even more remarkably, their rendition of the Salve Regina included deliberate pauses on phrases like "Turn thine eyes of mercy toward us," likely signals to turn toward the window where allies might pass messages. Secular women developed equally ingenious systems. In York Castle's debtors' prison, wives jailed alongside their husbands used knitting needles to tap rhythms on wooden cups, mimicking the sound of loom shuttles. To guards, it sounded like idle domestic activity, but the patterns conveyed which creditors could be bribed or which jailers would look the other way. Elsewhere, noblewomen like Elena Cobham, imprisoned for witchcraft in the 1400s, composed elaborate embroidery patterns that mirrored musical staffs sewing notes into tapestries that visiting musicians could then perform as coded updates on court politics. What makes these examples extraordinary is how they subverted contemporary gender norms. While male prisoners often relied on martial metaphors in their songs, women drew from domestic imagery that flew under the radar. A ballad about the unbroken thread might celebrate solidarity among captives, while references to mending torn cloth hinted at repairing escape tools. Even children's games became cover for communication records from a French prison describe little girls singing Ring Around the Rosy while subtly pointing to which guards carried keys. The legacy of these tactics echoes in unexpected places. A 16th century Spanish lullaby discovered scratched into a cell wall in Toledo alternates between triple and duple meter, a musical representation of the Morse-like tap code used centuries later by prisoners of war. Another haunting example comes from Prague's Jewish quarter, where women awaiting trial during pogroms adapted Sabbath Zemarot into warnings, using the traditional Avenue Malkanu melody but changing the lyrics to list informants' names. These weren't just survival strategies, they were acts of cultural preservation, ensuring traditions would outlive their persecutors. Perhaps most moving are the fragments left by anonymous women, a single line of verse etched into a bread platter in Naples, "The nightingale still sings in its cage," or the account of a Scottish washerwoman who taught her cellmates to harmonize the sound of scrubbing clothes into rhythmic messages. These women didn't just endure captivity, they composed its counterpoint, proving that oppression could shackle bodies but never the creativity that thrived in silence and turned it into song. The echoes of those medieval dungeon ballads didn't fade with the clang of castle gates. They rippled through centuries, resurfacing wherever voices needed to speak without being heard. Take the sorrow songs of enslaved Africans in the American South, where spirituals like "Wade in the Water" carried dual meanings. To plantation owners, they sounded like pious hymns, but to those singing them, the lyrics were survival manuals. The songs referenced to troubled waters, warned escapees to travel by river to throw off bloodhounds. This wasn't just mimicry of medieval tactics, it was proof that music's power to cloak rebellion transcends time and culture. Wars amplified this tradition. During World War II, British prisoners in Colditz Castle tapped Morse code through the plumbing, but they also adapted popular tunes. A jaunty rendition of "Home Sweet Home," slowed to a dirge, might indicate failed Red Cross parcel deliveries, while humming "The White Cliffs of Dover" off-key could signal spotted Allied planes. Meanwhile, French resistance fighters turned children's nursery rhymes into coordinates for sabotage. A lullaby about sleeping sheep might pinpoint an ammunition depot hidden in a barn. These weren't isolated cases. They were part of an unbroken chain stretching back to those medieval bards who first turned rhythm into resistance. Protest movements weaponized melody with equal precision. In apartheid South Africa, Miriam Makepe's "Potter Potter" sounded like a dance hit, but its lyrics about touching touch covertly rallied solidarity among black communities. Chilean folk singer Victor Jara, imprisoned before his execution in 1973, scribbled lyrics on scrap paper that fellow inmates memorized. His song, "Estadio Chile," later became an anthem against dictatorship, passed mouth to ear like the ballads of the Iron Tower. Even the Beatles, back in the USSR, took on subversive layers when bootlegged tapes circulated in Soviet prisons, where listeners decoded its upbeat rock as a metaphor for Western freedoms. Hip-hop carries the torch most visibly today. Rap's DNA is entwined with coded communication, from the drug trade metaphors of 1980s Bronx Cruise to Kendrick Lamar's "All Right," becoming a Black Lives Matter protest chant. The genre's obsession with double entendre and regional slang mirrors medieval bards' use of localized folklore. When Jay-Z name drops "Iceberg Slim" or Nas references Queensbridge, they're not just boasting, they're speaking in a lexicon that resonates deeply with some while flying over others' heads, precisely what those imprisoned troubadours achieved with their layered love songs. The thread connecting these moments isn't just clever wordplay, it's the understanding that melody makes messages sticky. Psychologists call it the song memory effect. Information set to music is 20% more likely to be remembered. Medieval prisoners knew this instinctively when they set escape plans to repetitive choruses. Civil rights marchers harnessed it with "We Shall Overcome," its simple, swaying melody ensuring even children could carry the movement's resolve. Ukrainian soldiers today sing folk tunes to coordinate drone strikes, proving that centuries after the last bard left his dungeon cell, music remains the ultimate sleight of hand, a way to shout secrets in plain earshot. What's truly remarkable is how technology has transformed rather than erased these practices. Medieval prisoners relied on oral tradition. Modern activists use Spotify playlists as encrypted manifests. Protesters in Hong Kong repurposed the children's song, "Glory to Hong Kong," as a rallying cry, while Iranian women upload Persian pop with veiled feminist lyrics to bypass censors. The tools have changed, but the core strategy remains: melody as camouflage, rhythm as resistance. Those long-ago bards strumming lutes in torchlit cells would recognize their legacy in every protest chant, every censored song that finds a way to be heard. Because when words alone are dangerous, music becomes the perfect Trojan horse carrying truth in its timbre and freedom in its beat. The crackling static of a 1930s wax cylinder recording holds more than just an old folk tune. It's a time capsule waiting to be cracked open with 21st century tools. Modern researchers aren't just reading medieval lyrics, they're listening between the notes with technology those prisoners could never have imagined. Take spectral analysis, which dissects audio into visual maps of frequencies. A ballad that sounds smooth to human ears might reveal jagged spikes when scanned, precisely at the moments where prisoners reportedly coughed or tapped their chains, marking hidden cues. In one groundbreaking study, a German team found unnatural harmonic clusters in a 15th century ploughman's song from Neuchâtel Castle. These turned out to align with the prison's architectural quirks. Certain notes resonated strongest near the weakest mortar joints in the walls, suggesting the song doubled as an acoustic blueprint for escape. Artificial intelligence has become the ultimate cryptographer for these musical puzzles. By feeding thousands of medieval lyrics into machine learning models, scholars can spot patterns no human could. An eye trained on Provençal troubadour songs recently detected a recurring 7-syllable structure in verses about spring, except during years of documented prison revolts when the pattern shifted to 11 syllables. Cross-referencing with climate data revealed why. 11 syllables matched the average rainfall in April, hinting that spring was code for escape attempts timed to spring floods that masked their tracks. This kind of analysis would have taken researchers decades manually. Now, algorithms connect dots across centuries in minutes. But the real game changer is multi-spectral imaging, originally developed for space telescopes. When applied to fragile songbooks from Spanish inquisitorial prisons, it exposed faint underlines and marginal dots invisible to the naked eye. These markings formed musical ciphers. A single dot above a note might lower its pitch by a quarter tone, altering the entire message like a musical Caesar shift. One recovered page from Seville's Archive of the Indies showed a hymn where every third note had been subtly marked with lemon juice, creating a separate melody when played staccato. The hidden tune's rhythm matched the footsteps of night patrols recorded in jailer logs, proving prisoners had turned their tormentors' routines into sheet music. Yet for all our tech, some codes still resist decoding. A Welsh harp tune called YGWRO Jelly, The Man from Kelly, contains eerie microtonal slides that medieval instruments couldn't physically produce. Researchers now suspect these weren't mistakes but sonic watermarks. If a prisoner heard the wrong notes, they'd know the performer was an imposter sent by jailers. Similarly, AI struggles with regional dialects in oral traditions. A Scottish prisoner's pronunciation of lock might carry meanings lost even to modern native speakers. The ethical dilemmas are as complex as the codes themselves. Should we digitize sacred hymns that prisoners intended only for certain ears? When a team in Krakow reconstructed a Jewish ghetto's lost melody from survivor testimony, some argued it violated the martyr's secrecy. Others countered that silence honors no one. Perhaps the answer lies in how these tools are wielded, not as bulldozers tearing open the past, but as delicate brushes uncovering whispers left deliberately faint. After all, the prisoners didn't hide their messages just to thwart jailers. They hid them so only the right ears would hear. 7 centuries later, with our algorithms and spectrograms, we're still learning to listen. Decoding the hidden meanings in medieval prisoner songs isn't just an academic exercise, it's an ethical tightrope walk. On one side, scholars armed with spectral analysis and AI argue that the patterns they've uncovered, like rhythmic anomalies or lyrical double entendres, are too precise to be accidental. But others push back, warning that our modern obsession with uncovering secrets might lead us to hear codes where none exist. After all, not every love song from a dungeon was a rebel manifesto. Sometimes a ballad about lost freedom was just a ballad about lost freedom. The danger lies in what historians call presentism, the bias of viewing the past through contemporary lenses. Imagine a future researcher dissecting a 21st century pop song, convinced the line, "dancing in the dark," was a literal reference to surviving power outages, rather than a metaphor for youthful uncertainty. This debate heats up around specific cases. Take the Ballad of the Iron Tower. Some linguists point to its shifting refrains as clear evidence of tactical updates, while musicologists counter that medieval composers often improvised variations for artistic flair. The truth might lie somewhere in between. A prisoner's lament could start as raw emotion, then later be repurposed as a signal, like how protest songs today often begin as personal outcries before becoming collective anthems. The key is context. When a song appears repeatedly in prison records just before documented escape attempts, as with the Provençal Ploughman's Tune, the coincidence strains credulity. But when a scholar claims every minor key in a religious hymn denotes underground resistance, skepticism is warranted. The ethical dilemma deepens when we consider cultural ownership. Many prisoner songs borrowed from folk traditions that belong to entire communities, not just captives. Deciphering them as purely cryptographic tools risks erasing their broader cultural significance. A Welsh bard's harp piece might contain escape instructions, but it could also preserve ancient mythological references unrelated to prison life. This isn't just academic nitpicking. It's about respecting the complexity of historical artifacts. Like a stained glass window, these songs refract different truths depending on the angle of interpretation. Then there's the question of silence. Some argue that by broadcasting decoded messages, we violate the prisoner's original intent. Their secrets were meant for specific ears, not YouTube algorithms. When researchers reconstructed a Hungarian freedom fighter's song from the 1500s, descendants pleaded against publication, fearing it would trivialize their ancestors' suffering. Yet others contend that silence honors no one, that these songs, as acts of resistance, demand to be heard. The compromise may lie in approach, treating the music not as puzzles to be solved, but as conversations to be joined, acknowledging that some meanings will forever remain between the notes. What's undeniable is how this debate mirrors larger tensions in studying marginalized histories. Do we prioritize factual precision, even if it risks sterilizing the past? Or do we embrace interpretive leaps if they amplify voices that oppression tried to silence? Perhaps the answer isn't binary. Like those medieval bards, we might need to hold multiple truths at once. that a song can be both art and artillery, both personal catharsis and political weapon, and that sometimes the most ethical response is to listen more than we claim to know. Gilles de Rais, the infamous French nobleman turned bard, composed his final songs not in a grand hall but in a dank cell awaiting execution. Once a celebrated military commander and patron of the arts, his fall from grace became one of medieval Europe's most chilling tales. As the noose tightened, his music took on a desperate duality, publicly pleading for divine mercy while privately encoding messages to remaining allies. His ballad, The Shadow of My Sins, outwardly confessed to crimes historians now debate he committed, but hidden in its irregular meter were numerical patterns matching the dates his accusers had allegedly fabricated evidence. Even in chains, his musical training became his last weapon, a way to protest his innocence without speaking treason. Contrast this with the enigmatic, singing monk of Cluny, whose identity remains lost to time. Imprisoned during the papal schisms of the 14th century, he transformed his cell into a makeshift choir stall. Where Gilles fought captivity with musical cryptography, this anonymous cleric embraced it as spiritual discipline. His legendary Prison Psalter, a cycle of hymns based on the 7 canonical hours, was said to induce visions in fellow prisoners. Guards reported hearing unearthly harmonies emanating from his cell, though he was alone. Modern scholars suggest he may have discovered the acoustic properties of his stone walls, using reverberation to create the illusion of multiple voices. To his captors, it was sorcery. To his fellow inmates, it was proof heaven hadn't abandoned them. Then there's the curious case of Owain ap Griffith, a Welsh bard prince imprisoned by Edward I. His Songs of the Tower blended traditional Welsh Singhained poetry with Norman musical forms, a sonic olive branch that masked defiance. By setting English lyrics to Welsh harmonic structures, he created melodies that soothed his jailers while stirring nationalist fervor in Welsh-speaking guards. One ballad praising the oak's deep roots was actually a detailed map of underground tunnels beneath the Tower of London, its rhyming couplets corresponding to turns and distances. His genius lay in exploiting cultural blind spots. The English heard pastoral flattery, while the Welsh heard a rebel's roadmap. These figures reveal the spectrum of musical resistance. At one end, Gilles de Rais, the artist, weaponizing his craft for survival. At the other, the singing monk transforming confinement into transcendence. And between them, Owain ap Griffith, the diplomat bard who played both sides. What unites them isn't just their talent, but their understanding that in extremis, music becomes more than sound. It's a lifeline, a manifesto, sometimes even a time capsule. When Owain's songs were finally decoded centuries later, they didn't just recount his plight, they preserved the very cadence of his breath, the tremor of his hands on the harp strings. In that sense, these imprisoned bards achieved the impossible. They made stone walls porous, turning echoes into immortality. The haunting melodies of dungeon ballads didn't just echo off prison walls, they reverberated through the very pages of medieval literature, transforming the way stories were told. Epic poems like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight didn't just feature imprisoned knights, they gave them voices that soared in verse, mirroring the real-life bards who turned captivity into art. When the titular Green Knight sings taunting riddles to Gawain, it's more than poetic flair, it's a literary nod to the coded challenges prisoners hurled at their jailers through song. Even the structure of these tales borrowed from musical traditions. The repetitive refrains in Beowulf, for instance, echo the mnemonic devices bards used to smuggle messages, turning oral rhythms into written cadences that stuck in the mind like a half-remembered tune. Romances of the period took this fusion further. In Encryption de Troyes Lancelot, the knight's imprisonment isn't just a plot device, it's a stage for musical subterfuge. His mournful songs about Guinevere carried double meanings, much like the ballads of real prisoners who wrapped rebellion in romance. The Roman de la Rose, that sprawling allegory of love, even includes a scene where the lover is literally imprisoned in a tower, his only solace a lute. To medieval audiences, this wasn't just symbolism, it was a reflection of the world they knew, where music and imprisonment were inextricably linked. The influence flowed both ways. Just as prisoner songs shaped literature, written works gave bards new material to encode. Dante's Inferno, with its vivid depictions of damned souls, inspired prisoners to adapt its imagery into their own hellish soundscapes. A troubadour in a Milanese dungeon might sing of the frozen lake from Canto 32, but to his fellow captives, it signaled the warden's cold-heartedness or the icy moat surrounding their prison. This interplay between page and performance created a feedback loop. Stories became songs, which in turn inspired new stories, each layer richer with hidden meaning. Religious texts weren't immune to this cross-pollination. The Gesta Romanorum, a collection of moral tales popular in monasteries, includes a story about a minstrel who wins his freedom by playing a song that makes the emperor weep. Historians suspect this tale grew from real accounts of bards whose music softened jailers' hearts. Even illuminated manuscripts hint at the connection. Marginal doodles of harp-playing prisoners appear in psalters and chronicles, as if scribes couldn't help but acknowledge music's role in the drama of confinement. What's often overlooked is how these literary adaptations preserved prisoner songs that might otherwise have vanished. When a bard's coded ballad about the thorny rose found its way into a chivalric romance, it froze that moment of resistance in ink, saving it from the ephemeral nature of sound. Today, scholars combing through the Canterbury Tales have spotted stray lines that match fragments of prison songs recorded in judicial archives, proof that Chaucer, ever the observer, wove real prisoners' voices into his fictional pilgrimage. The legacy of this fusion endures in surprising ways. Modern fantasy novels, from The Name of the Wind to A Song of Ice and Fire, still give their imprisoned characters musical voices, unwitting heirs to a tradition born in medieval dungeons. But the true testament lies in how seamlessly these songs blurred the line between art and survival, proving that even in chains, stories like music refused to be silenced. Religion didn't just comfort medieval prisoners, it armed them with a secret language of defiance. When a captive nun sang Psalm 137, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept," her jailers heard pious submission. But to her fellow inmates, those same words crackled with rebellion, comparing their prison to Babylonian exile and vowing, like the psalmist, to never forget their homeland. This duality was religion's power. Its scriptures provided ready-made metaphors that sounded devotional to authorities but carried incendiary meanings to the initiated. A hymn about Daniel surviving the lion's den wasn't just scripture. It was a survival manual, with the lions representing corrupt jailers and the angel who shut their mouths symbolizing outside allies. Even Jonah's 3 days in the whale's belly took on new resonance, with prisoners interpreting it as code for enduring short sentences before metaphorical resurrection to freedom. The adaptability of religious texts made them perfect templates for covert communication. Gregorian chants, with their fixed Latin lyrics, could be tweaked subtly, a lengthened syllable here, a stressed word there, to embed messages without altering the sacred text. In the Spanish Inquisition's prisons, conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, reportedly used the Agnus Dei liturgy to signal danger. The line, "Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world," became a warning when sung with a slight tremolo on takes, indicating guards were confiscating contraband. Meanwhile, Protestant martyrs during Mary Tudor's reign turned the Magnificat's call to cast down the mighty from their thrones into a rallying cry against Catholic persecutors, its revolutionary undertones masked by liturgical familiarity. This spiritual coding wasn't limited to Christianity. In Moorish dungeons during the Reconquista, imprisoned Sufi poets composed verses using imagery from Rumi's mystical works. A line about the rose garden within might map secret prayer rooms in the prison, while references to the drunken beggar could denote informants feigning loyalty. Jewish captives, particularly during pogroms, embedded Torah verses into lament, singing, "Out of the depths I call to you," from Psalm 130, not as despair but as coordinates, with the depths indicating tunnels beneath the cell block. What unified these traditions was their shared technique, using sacred language's ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability while stirring hearts toward resistance. Religious music also provided structural advantages for coding. The call and response format of many hymns allowed leaders to discreetly update information. Changing a single word in the refrain could alert prisoners to shifted escape timelines. The repetitive nature of chants helped memorize complex plans. Scholars have documented cases where the number of repetitions in an Amen chorus corresponded to the days until a planned revolt. Even the physicality of worship concealed signals. Kneeling during certain verses might block guards' view of hand signs, while the synchronized standing and sitting of liturgical movements could mask the passing of tools or notes. Perhaps most crucially, religion lent moral authority to rebellion. When Waldensian heretics imprisoned in the Alps sang, "The Lord hears the cry of the poor," they weren't just quoting scripture, they were framing their persecution as part of a divine narrative where justice would prevail. This theological underpinning transformed survival into sacred duty. A 15th century Hussite prisoner's song discovered in a Bohemian dungeon illustrates this perfectly. Its surface lyrics praised Saint Vaclav, while its hidden acrostic spelled "Truth Conquers," the rallying cry of their reformist movement. By cloaking resistance in holiness, these prisoners turned their songs into something unassailable. After all, what jailer would dare forbid the singing of a psalm? The legacy of this fusion endures in unexpected places. Modern protest movements from the U.S. civil rights era to Poland's Solidarity Union have similarly repurposed hymns, proving that the medieval prisoner's insight remains timeless. When earthly laws chain the body, sacred music can set the spirit free and sometimes spark the flames that melt the chains themselves. The Caesar shift cipher, where letters slide predictably down the alphabet, and the Enigma machine's spinning rotors represent the precision of mechanical code breaking. But medieval musical ciphers operated on an entirely different wavelength. Where a cryptographer might rely on mathematical patterns, an imprisoned bard leaned on the collective memory of his listeners, embedding clues in the curve of a melody or the grit of a stressed syllable. Take the difference between cracking the enigma and deciphering the Ballad of the Iron Tower. The enigma's codes were physical, its settings documented in logbooks. But the ballad's secrets lived in the spaces between notes, in the way a prisoner's voice might catch on the word chains, turning a lament into a warning. One required a mathematician, the other demanded a cultural insider who knew that north wind meant more than weather. This cultural anchoring made musical codes remarkably adaptable and perilously ephemeral. The Caesar cipher works the same whether you're in Rome or Cairo, but a medieval prisoner's song about the fox's den might mean an escape route to a French captive and a traitor's cell to a German one. Oral traditions allowed meanings to shift with circumstances. A ballad that signaled wait during a siege might later mean strike after reinforcements arrived, all without changing a single word. Compare that to the rigidity of the Vijna cipher, where a fixed keyword spells disaster if compromised. The very flexibility that kept prisoners one step ahead of jailers also meant their codes could vanish overnight. When the last person who knew that harp strings meant guard rotations died, that knowledge dissolved like mist, unlike the Rosetta Stone, which preserved hieroglyphics for millennia. Yet fragility came with strengths. Mechanical ciphers leave evidence a coded letter can be intercepted, a cipher wheel confiscated. But how do you confiscate a melody? A prisoner's song existed only in performance, leaving no physical trail. The Enigma machine's wiring could be reverse engineered, but try reverse engineering a bard's fleeting vibrato or the way he tapped his foot during the chorus. Even if jailers recorded the lyrics, they often missed the vital context, like how a 13th-century Catalan rebellion used children's rhyming games to coordinate attacks. To outsiders, it sounded like play. To initiates, the rhyme's syllable counts mapped patrol schedules. The closest modern equivalent might be Cold War dead drops, but even those required physical tokens. Medieval musical codes were the ultimate deniable communication, plausible art first, covert tool second. What truly set these systems apart was their humanity. Breaking the enigma required understanding machinery. Decoding a prisoner's ballad demanded understanding people. When scholars today analyze the singing monk of Cluny's harmonies, they're not just studying notes, they're piecing together how desperation and devotion twisted pitch and rhythm into something transcendent. That's why, for all our supercomputers, some medieval songs still resist decoding. You can't run a spectral analysis on trust or an algorithm on shared trauma. The gaps in our knowledge aren't just missing data, they're echoes of whispered conversations, of a hand squeezing another's in the dark as the song's true meaning passed between them without a word. This comparison reveals a paradox. The more technologically advanced a cipher, the more brittle it becomes. The enigma fell because its complexity created patterns. Medieval songs endured because their simplicity masked depth. A machine can be silenced, but a melody, once it's in someone's heart, not even dungeon walls can stop it from being sung again. Beneath the dust of centuries, archaeologists have uncovered silent witnesses to the songs that once defied dungeon walls. Artifacts that bridge the gap between legend and reality. In the ruins of York Castle's debtor's prison, a bone flute was discovered nestled between floorboards, its finger holes worn smooth by desperate hands. Carbon dating places it in the 14th century, but the real revelation came when a musician reconstructed it and played. The instrument produced a haunting pentatonic scale, an Eastern influence unexpected in medieval England, until prison records revealed the flutist was a captured Ottoman merchant using the melodies of his homeland to communicate with fellow captives. This wasn't just a crude noisemaker, it was a precision tool, its tuning matching harmonic patterns found in Turkish folk songs about liberation. Equally telling are the graffiti-covered walls of Şeytao Dif, where prisoners etched musical staves alongside their names. At first glance, these seem like idle doodles until researchers noticed recurring symbols above the notes, tiny arrows and dots. Digital overlays of these markings revealed they aligned with the castle's acoustics, indicating where sound would carry farthest. One etching even depicts a lute with strings labeled not by pitch, but by guard names suggesting each string's vibration symbolized a specific jailer's patrol route. These weren't random scratches, they were blueprints for sonic espionage, left by prisoners who turned stone into sheet music. Perhaps the most chilling find emerged from a Spanish Inquisition prison in Toledo, a set of iron manacles with grooves worn into the wrist cuffs. Initially dismissed as where from struggle, forensic analysis showed the patterns were too precise. When replicated and struck together, the manacles produced distinct pitches matching a Mozarabic hymn fragment. Prisoner testimonies later confirmed the practice. Chained captives would rhythmically clink their restraints to mimic devotional songs, using the tempo to coordinate meal protests. The very objects meant to silence them became instruments of resistance. Even children left their mark. In the Tower of London's Salt Tower, a small carving shows a harp with broken strings beside a date. The same month records note a young noble's failed escape. Historians now believe this was no coincidence. Broken strings were a common prisoner symbol for aborted plans, and the harp's 7 strings corresponded to the 7 guards stationed that night. The carving wasn't just art, it was a warning to future prisoners about which shifts were overstaffed. Modern technology breathes new life into these relics. CT scans of a game piece from a Nuremberg dungeon revealed hollow chambers inside a whistle designed to mimic bird calls, its frequencies tuned to bypass the guard's hearing range. Archaeoacoustics, the study of ancient soundscapes, has reconstructed how a single note sung in Poznan prison's oubliette would reverberate for 12 seconds, long enough to send a coded echo up ventilation shafts. Each discovery peels back another layer, proving these weren't just objects but nodes in a vast, silent network. The real revelation, the most sophisticated cryptographic tool in medieval Europe, wasn't made of gears or parchment. It was the human voice, an iron chain, a scrap of bone. And their messages, etched in stone and memory, still resonate today. The dungeon's most cunning composers weren't always the prisoners. Sometimes they were the jailers themselves. Noblemen quickly realized the power of those echoing ballads and decided to hijack the melody. Picture a lord commissioning his court bard to craft a song about his merciful reign, ensuring it spread through the prison like honeyed poison. These weren't heartfelt tributes, they were sonic propaganda designed to manipulate both captives and the public. Take the infamous Ballad of the Gracious Duke, circulated in 15th century Burgundian prisons. Its lilting verses praised the Duke for feeding prisoners white bread and wine, while prison logs from the same period list moldy crusts and stagnant water. The disconnect wasn't accidental, it was psychological warfare, weaponizing music to rewrite reality. The tactics were devilishly effective. A noble might order a ballad portraying his political rival as a dungeon torturer, set to a catchy tune that even the rival's own soldiers would hum unwittingly. In York Castle, records show jailers paid minstrels to sing exaggerated tales of escaped prisoners being torn apart by wolves' songs that conveniently omitted how those wolves were actually the noble's hunting dogs. The goal wasn't just to scare, it was to seed narratives. Like modern spin doctors, these medieval propagandists understood that a melody sticks in the mind longer than a decree. But the real masterstroke was co-opting the prisoner's own musical codes. Savvy nobles employed turncoat bards to compose fake versions of popular prison anthems, swapping rebellion for resignation. A famous example is The Nightingale's Chain, supposedly sung by captives in the Tower of London. Its original lyrics celebrated defiance, but the noble-approved rewrite spun it as a parable about accepting one's fate. Jailers would force prisoners to perform these twisted versions during feast days, turning their own cultural touchstones into tools of submission. The psychological impact was brutal. When a trusted prisoner's song suddenly preached compliance, it sowed distrust among inmates. Was the singer a traitor, or had hope truly died? Some nobles took this further, staging elaborate musical charades. A Milanese duke once planted a bard among prisoners to sing a coded ballad hinting at a fake escape route. Those who took the bait found themselves ambushed, their trust in musical messages shattered. Yet these propaganda songs often contained their own coded layers, just not the ones prisoners expected. Historians analyzing the mercy of Lord Roland noticed odd rhythmic breaks that matched the nobles' accounting ledgers. The song's true audience wasn't the prisoners, it was other nobles using musical flourishes to boast about prison revenues without vulgar ledger talk. Even in manipulation, the medieval elite couldn't resist showing off. The legacy of these sonic power plays lingers in plain sight. Next time you hear a national anthem or a corporate jingle, listen closely. You might hear echoes of those dungeon ballads where every note was a pawn in someone else's game. The prisoners sang to survive, but the nobles, they composed to conquer. And in that clash of melodies, the real battle wasn't for the body, it was for the mind. The golden age of musical cryptography didn't vanish overnight. It faded like a ballad's final note, gradually drowned out by the clatter of printing presses and the scratch of quills on parchment. By the Renaissance, prisons were no longer the chaotic, loosely guarded dungeons of medieval lore. They'd become systematized with standardized record-keeping and regimented guard rotations that left little room for the old rhythmic codes. Why risk a tapped-out message on a cell wall when you could slip a written petition to a sympathetic lawyer? The spread of literacy transformed dissent from an oral tradition into a written one. Pamphlets smuggled between bars carried precise details that songs could only hint at: names, dates, legal precedents. A prisoner in Elizabethan England might compose a biting satire about corrupt jailers, but he'd more likely draft a writ of habeas corpus than encode it in a lute melody. Yet the old ways didn't disappear, they retreated into the margins. Folk music became the keeper of these clandestine traditions, especially among those still excluded from the written word. In the Scottish Highlands, where Gaelic literacy lagged behind English, Jacobite rebels in the 17th century still used harp tunes to coordinate uprisings. The song "Mo Run Giel Dilias, My Faithful Fair One" sounded like a love ballad to British soldiers, but its irregular time signatures reportedly signaled muster points for clandestine meetings. Similarly, Hungarian shepherds imprisoned during anti-Habsburg revolts adapted medieval pastoral tunes, using the calls of imaginary birds to denote which border crossings were unguarded. These weren't holdovers from a bygone era, they were deliberate choices, proving that some messages still flowed best through melody rather than ink. The printing press, ironically, helped preserve what it made obsolete. Broadside ballads, cheap printed sheets of song lyrics, became vehicles for veiled dissent. A seemingly innocuous drinking song like "The Miller's Joy" might contain a hidden acrostic spelling, "tax revolt," when certain lines were highlighted, allowing protesters to distribute coded instructions under the guise of entertainment. This hybrid approach thrived in places like Germany during the Peasants' War, where printed lyrics could be mass-produced but their true meanings were still passed orally, creating a layered system of communication that baffled authorities. Even as musical codes lost their urgency in prisons, they gained new life in the streets. The Renaissance's rigid class structures birthed a counterculture of beggars and thieves who developed their own cant languages, many of which were sung rather than spoken. A madrigal performed in a Venetian alley might sound like polyphonic art music to the untrained ear, but its overlapping lyrics contained thieves' slang and warnings about guard patrols. This underground musical shorthand persisted well into the 18th century, evolving into the sea shanties of smugglers and the work songs of indentured laborers. What's often overlooked is how these fading traditions influenced Renaissance music itself. Composers like Orlando di Lasso and Carlo Gesualdo experimented with chromaticism and dissonance that some scholars now believe mimicked the unsettling qualities of prison songs. The madrigal's abrupt shifts between joy and despair may have roots in the coded ballads of political prisoners, where a single minor chord could signal danger. When Monteverdi wrote of the warrior's lament in his operas, he was channeling a centuries-old tradition of musical resistance, one that had begun in dungeons but now echoed in courtly theaters. The decline wasn't uniform either. In regions where repression intensified, so did musical subterfuge. Spanish Jews forced into converso status during the Inquisition developed a whole genre of double talk romances songs that praised Christian saints on the surface but invoked Kabbalistic numerology in their verse structures. Their melodies often followed the modal scales of Sephardic liturgy, creating a musical fingerprint recognizable only to those raised in the tradition. Here, music's ambiguity became its greatest asset. You couldn't burn a melody at the auto-da-fe. By the time the Enlightenment dawned, the art of musical cryptography had largely migrated from prisons to parlors, becoming more intellectual game than survival tool. Yet its legacy lingered in unexpected ways. Mozart's The Magic Flute brims with Masonic musical codes, while Beethoven's Fidelio, an opera about prison rescue, uses disruptive key changes to mirror the chaos of a jailbreak. These weren't just artistic choices, they were unconscious revivals of a language once spoken in whispers between cell bars. The Renaissance may have silenced the dungeon songs as practical tools, but their echoes tuned the very foundations of Western music, proof that even the most seemingly obsolete codes never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to be sung again. A lone lute hums in a dimly lit chapel, its strings vibrating with notes not heard in 500 years. This isn't a relic, it's a resurrection. Across the globe, a quiet revolution is unfolding as medieval music scholars and experimental archaeologists join forces to recreate the lost soundscapes of prisoner ballads. Using everything from fox-fur bowstrings to reconstructed bone flutes, they're peeling back layers of silence to reveal how these songs might have truly sounded. At the University of Cambridge, a team spent 3 years analyzing the acoustics of surviving dungeon spaces, discovering that certain notes would have resonated unnaturally long in stone corridors, a feature prisoners likely exploited to amplify coded messages. Their performance of the Ballad of the Iron Tower, in the very cell that inspired it, sends chills down spines. The melody's lowest notes vibrate through the floor at a frequency that historical records suggest made guards' keys rattle on their belts. The process is part forensic science, part artistic intuition. When early music ensemble Sequentia reconstructed songs from the 13th century Regensburg prison, they faced a puzzle. The surviving lyrics referenced instruments like the devil's fiddle, a term lost to time. By cross-referencing trial transcripts and wood carvings, they realized it described a rebec played with a metal nail instead of a bow, a technique that produced a rasping tone perfect for cutting through dungeon noise. The result, a rendition of The Jailer's Daughter, so unnerving that modern listeners report physical discomfort during its dissonant passages, exactly the reaction prisoners may have sought to unsettle their captors. Technology has become an unexpected ally in this sonic archaeology. At Bristol University, engineers developed a virtual reality model of the Tower of London's Salt Tower, allowing musicians to perform in its exact acoustic environment. Singers report how the space alters their natural vibrato, forcing them into the tense, nasal delivery described in medieval accounts. Meanwhile, spectral analysis of ancient instrument fragments reveals microgrooves on bone flutes where patterns that suggest specific finger tremolos used to create vibrato effects for signaling. These aren't artistic choices, they're cryptographic necessities, now audible again after centuries. Some reconstructions blur the line between scholarship and activism. When Syrian musician Weed Bauhassan recorded 13th century Crusader prison songs in the dungeons of Crac des Chevaliers, now a UNESCO site, she noticed the Arabic maqam scales matched the melodic contours of the original Latin notations. Her collaboration with French troubadour Benjamin Bagby didn't just revive the music, it revealed how captors and captives had musically influenced each other across enemy lines. Similarly, Inuit throat singer Tanya Tagak's reinterpretation of a Viking prisoner's chant from the Greenlandic sagas incorporates guttural gasps that scholars now believe mimic the sounds of icebergs cracking, a sonic metaphor for breaking free that transcended language barriers. Yet these projects spark fierce debates. Should reconstructions use period-accurate gut strings that snap mid-performance, authentically recreating the instability prisoners faced, or does that romanticize suffering? When Catalan ensemble El Ham de Foc performed The Chains of Barcelona with actual iron shackles as percussion, some historians praised their visceral impact while others criticized it as trauma theater. The ethical lines blur further with artificial intelligence projects like Oxford's Lost Songs Initiative use machine learning to generate plausible completions for fragmented ballads, raising questions about whether we're rediscovering history or inventing it. What emerges from these efforts is more than historical curiosity. It's a radical reimagining of how we connect with the past. When Norwegian folk singer Agnes Bjørn Garnes sings the Hafrsfjord prisoner's lament, while walking the exact fjord path the captive would have seen from his cell, the landscape itself becomes an instrument. The wind, the water's rhythm, even the cry of gulls align with the song's cadences in ways sheet music could never capture. These performances don't just tell us what happened, they let us feel the weight of a chain, the dryness of a throat singing through fear, the way hope might have clung to a rising melodic line like fingers gripping a windowsill. In that moment, history stops being facts behind glass. It becomes a vibration in the air, as fleeting and alive as it was the day it was first sung into the darkness. The echoes of those medieval dungeon songs don't just belong to the past, they pulse through our modern world with uncanny urgency. Think about the last time you streamed a protest song or hummed a melody that carried hidden meaning to those who knew how to listen. The parallels between a 15th century bard encoding escape plans in a ballad and a dissident today masking subversive lyrics in a viral pop track aren't just poetic, they're proof that music's power to resist oppression transcends centuries. In an era where governments track digital footprints and algorithms scrub dissent from social media, the medieval prisoner's ingenuity feels less like history and more like a playbook for modern survival. Consider how today's protesters adopt similar tactics. When Belarusian activists in 2020 used folk songs to coordinate demonstrations, they weren't just honoring tradition, they were exploiting the same loophole medieval prisoners discovered. Authorities can censor words, but melody slips through the cracks. A catchy chorus about spring flowers might sound innocuous to surveillance bots, but to the crowd it signaled meeting points and police movements. This isn't coincidence, it's human ingenuity rediscovering the same tools under similar pressures. Even the Hong Kong protesters' use of "A Glory to Hong Kong" mirrors medieval strategies, a seemingly patriotic anthem that became a rallying cry against authoritarian rule, its lyrics layered with double meanings just like those dungeon ballads about the unyielding tower. What's even more striking is how modern technology amplifies these age-old techniques. Medieval bards relied on oral transmission to spread their coded songs. Today, encrypted apps and blockchain-backed playlists serve the same purpose. Iranian women upload Persian pop with feminist lyrics to platforms like SoundCloud, knowing the algorithms won't flag metaphors about caged birds the way they'd redact explicit political statements. Ukrainian soldiers share TikTok videos of folk songs with geotagged clues about Russian troop movements, hiding tactical data in plain sight, just like prisoners who once signaled escape routes through harp melodies. The mediums have changed, but the core strategy remains. When speech is policed, music becomes the ultimate Trojan horse. Beyond protest, these songs remind us of art's role in preserving humanity under duress. The prisoners who carved bone flutes or tapped rhythms on chains weren't just sending messages. They were asserting their right to create beauty in the midst of brutality. That same defiance echoes in the makeshift instruments of refugee camps, where children turn soda cans into drums, or in the underground punk concerts held in basements under repressive regimes. Psychologists studying modern detainees from Guantanamo to political prisons confirm what medieval jailers learned the hard way. Those who sing or compose music withstand isolation and torture far better than those deprived of artistic expression. The act of creation, whether a 600-year-old ballad or a rapper's freestyle in a solitary confinement cell, becomes an act of rebellion against dehumanization. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the universality of these practices. From enslaved Africans weaving escape routes into spirituals to indigenous Australians using didgeridoo rhythms to pass warnings under colonial rule, every persecuted culture has independently discovered music's cryptographic potential. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's evidence of something fundamental about human nature. When stripped of every other tool, we instinctively reshape sound into both weapon and shield. The medieval prisoners didn't know their songs would one day inspire whistleblowers leaking secrets through Spotify playlists or journalists embedding data in podcast waveforms, but their legacy lives on in every melody that carries what words alone cannot safely say. So the next time you hear a protest chant at a rally or catch a pop song with suspiciously pointed lyrics, remember, you're witnessing the latest verse in a very old song. Those dungeon ballads weren't just survival tools, they were blueprints for a timeless truth. Oppression may chain hands and silence tongues, but it has yet to invent a cage that can hold a melody. And as long as that remains true, the songs of the past will keep speaking to the present, reminding us that resistance doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it just needs to sing. The songs of captured bards were more than melodies, they were maps, messages, and manifestos hidden in plain sight. These weren't just tunes to pass the time, they were lifelines woven from rhythm and rhyme, carrying the weight of desperate hopes and clandestine plans. Imagine a world where every strum of a lute could be a signal, every shift in tempo a warning, and every lyric a breadcrumb trail to freedom. That's the world these prisoners inhabited, a world where creativity wasn't just an escape but a weapon. By decoding these forgotten prisoner codes, we uncover a hidden chapter of medieval history, one where music was the ultimate act of defiance. Think about the sheer audacity it took to compose a ballad under the watchful eyes of jailers, knowing that a single misstep could mean torture or worse. Yet these bards and their fellow captives turned their cages into concert halls, their chains into percussion instruments, and their silence into a symphony of resistance. Their songs weren't just art, they were acts of rebellion, proof that even in the darkest corners of history, the human spirit refuses to be silenced. As we reflect on these stories, let's remember the power of art to transcend barriers, both then and now. The same ingenuity that fueled medieval dungeon ballads lives on today in protest anthems, coded hip-hop lyrics, and even the viral TikTok songs that carry subversive messages under the radar of censors. Music's ability to hide truth in plain sight, to unite strangers in shared purpose, and to outlast the very walls meant to contain it. That's a legacy as timeless as the notes themselves. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's untold stories. There are countless other mysteries waiting to be unraveled, from the secret symbols of Renaissance artists to the hidden languages of wartime spies. And tell us in the comments, what song would you use to send a secret message? Would it be a folk tune with layered meanings, a pop song with a sly double entendre, or something entirely your own? The tradition of musical resistance isn't just history, it's a living, breathing practice, and who knows, your voice might just be the next verse in this unending song of defiance.